a look at possibly the first historically documented state of ancient Iran, one that had a continuous civilization for perhaps 3,000 years. Specifically, I'm talking about a region of southern Iran called Elam and its people, the Elamites. Mostly vilified in ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts, the Elamites have more or less been portrayed as the great antagonists to Mesopotamian civilization. Of course, there are many sides to any story, and the Elamites are no exception. So without further ado, let's explore that fascinating story of Elam and the Elamites. First though, let's actually define what Elam is. It's a name that may be familiar to you, especially if you've been watching or listening to many of the programs on this channel. It also appears in the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible. However, Elam appears most frequently in the documents of ancient Mesopotamia. The term Elamite was used by the peoples of Mesopotamia to generally describe the inhabitants of the lands to their east, what today are the southern highlands of Iran and the alluvial plain of Susiana. From the time of the earliest Sumerian texts to nearly 2,000 years later, when Ashurbanipal claims to have wiped them off the map, Elam and the Elamites had always existed alongside the great civilizations of Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, most of the sources about the Elamites that we have come from Mesopotamia, and they're generally not very positive. Many of them, especially during Neo-Sumerian and Neo-Assyrian times, are just outright anti-Elamite propaganda. In this series, I'm going to do my best to get to the truth of the matter by examining as many sources as possible. In Sumerian, the term for Elam is Nimaki. The Akkadian form of the word is Elamtu. Derivatives of this latter word were later transferred into other languages where it was used in texts including the Old Testament, Greek, and Roman writings. It's from these that we get the name Elam in most of our modern languages. The Elamites themselves, though, called their country Haltamti or Hatamti. Since Elam is the most common name that we use today, I'll use that throughout the program. Now, it must be noted that the term Elamite didn't necessarily denote an ethnicity, but more the peoples of the lands east of Mesopotamia that spoke a particular language and overall had a similar culture. Since Elam territorially was quite vast, it's likely that it contained several ethnic groups, as well as several dialects of the Elamite language. There may have been other languages spoken that we just don't know about. For the most part, though, the peoples of Mesopotamia considered all of these peoples to be Elamites. Geographically speaking, the border of what we now call Elam appears to have been quite fluid. Like with Sumer, Elam also consisted of many different city-states and political entities. Of these, the two most famous, and probably also the most powerful, were Susa and Anshan. Quite often, the kingdom of Awan is also thrown in with them, at times being referred to as part of Elam, and at other times as a separate kingdom. Awan, though, did share a common culture and language with Susa, Anshan, and other areas that we identify as being parts of Elam, so grouping it with them makes sense. So now that we have a general idea of what Elam was, let's explore a bit more of its long history. And yes, it is long, over 2,000 years at minimum. While more or less continuous, no doubt a lot occurred during that time. Think about it like this. Imagine what Rome was like in the year 0, and think of how much it's changed from then up until now. That's actually shorter than the span of time we're going to try to cover here. Speaking of spans of time, we generally classify Elamite history into 3 main stages according to general changes in the language. These are the Old Elamite period, the Middle Elamite period, and the Neo-Elamite period. However, before we get into the periods mentioned, I want to at least expose you to another important era, the Proto-Elamite period. Proto-Elamite is the term that historians and archaeologists use to designate the people, art, and culture of Elam during the late 4th to early 3rd millennium BCE, or to be more specific, the 500 years spanning 3200 to 2700 BCE. Over 1,400 seals and tablets with a sort of pictographic writing or signs have been found from this time period, especially in and around the ancient city of Susa. The geographic spread, though, of such texts is quite astonishing. They're found not only in Susa, but in Anshan, and as far as an area called Shari Sukte, a site that today is on the Iranian-Afghan border. There's not a lot of information that can be derived from these texts, but they're quite distinct from the Elamite writing and art that would follow. Of course, we're assuming that the people from the Proto-Elamite period are indeed direct ancestors of the Elamites mentioned later on in Sumerian texts. Around 2500 BCE, it seems that this pictographic writing evolved into a more syllabic writing system with a linear script and about 80 different signs. The Proto-Elamite period is also known for its amazing artwork, especially bronze and silver items. For much of its early history, it seems that Elam and the early Sumerian city-states of southern Mesopotamia traded with each other and more or less coexisted peacefully. Of course, as seems to almost always occur in history, ambitious rulers tend to desire more, greed overtakes them, and soon open conflicts over land and resources arise. As you may have guessed, this happened between the peoples of Mesopotamia and Elam. At first, these were small, cross-border raids along the peripheries of the two lands. Later on, though, they would transform into full-scale conflicts between kingdoms and empires. In ancient writings, mention of Elam seems to have first appeared around 3000 BCE in texts from the Sumerian city of Uruk. What's also interesting is that there have been Elamite tablets that have been found from around the same time period as those of Uruk. Both of these, though, offer very fragmentary information and mostly contain the names of various kings, royal capitals, and terse statements referring to various conflicts. However, they do allude to the fact that these two writing systems developed into something more complex around the same time period. There is also mention of Elam in conflicts with the city-state of Kish. One of the Sumerian king lists reads that King Enmegarezi, who was a member of the first dynasty of Kish, and I quote, made the land of Elam lay down its weapons. In addition, though the names aren't given, there are 3 kings of Awan who appear on the Sumerian king list, which probably implies that for at least some time, even if short, kings of Sumer paid tribute to, or perhaps were under the authority of kings in Elam. Other significant mentions of Elam occur in documents from the city-state of Lagash. One is where King Eannatum of Lagash claims to have fought what seems to have been a defensive war against a coalition of Elamite cities, including Susa. In one inscription, he claims to have, and I quote, sent the Elamite back to his land. Another attack took place a generation or two afterward when a band of about 600 Elamites raided Lagash and went off with some loot. They tried to escape via a port on the Persian Gulf called Guaba, but were defeated. All that they had stolen was also brought back safely to Lagash. I suppose mention of Guaba is a good place to talk about the economy in those days. I know in past programs when I've mentioned Elam, I often talk about kings, armed conflicts, and the like, but believe it or not, the peoples of Mesopotamia weren't always at war with the Elamites. They traded with them too. One of the ways that they did this was via the many waterways that coalesced into the Persian Gulf. Located on the Gulf's coast was Guaba, one of the main seaports within this trade network. From here, ships would proceed along 2 main sea routes. One of them went along the coast of what is today Iran to the mouth of the Karun River, and from there, goods were taken upland into Elam. The other route from Guaba went to the opposite side of the Persian Gulf, to the areas along the Arabian coast, including lands of legendary wealth such as Dilmun, today which is modern Bahrain, Qatar, and parts of the eastern shores of Saudi Arabia. From there, they could travel to Makkan, modern-day Oman. So, what exactly did they trade? All sorts of commodities. Crops such as barley appear in many commercial texts uncovered from Lagash. Flour was also transported, as was pig fat. Yes, that was a thing of great value back then. In addition, inventory tablets mention wool, textiles, perfume, timber, certain types of spices, cows, useful metals such as tin, copper, silver, and unfortunately, slaves. So, pretty much anything of value that could fit onto a ship passed through Guaba. Trade also occurred over land. Documents from Lagash also state that the city of Deir was a regional trade hub for goods coming in and out of Elam. Though we primarily have records of commercial transactions between Lagash and groups of Elamites, it's pretty safe to conclude that other city-states of Mesopotamia also had extensive trade ties with Elam. So as you can see, Elam and Mesopotamia were quite intertwined. This would lead to several armed conflicts between the two, something we'll discuss in the next program. Anyway, thanks so much for stopping by.